It is often said that life has a way of silencing those who mock and elevating those who persevere. Yet when Daniel was 17 years old, standing in the middle of a crowded street with a mop in his hands and humiliation burning in his chest, no one could have guessed what his future held. To the world around him, he was just a boy, an orphan with no last name that mattered, no fortune, no voice. But one day, the same boy everyone overlooked would rise to build an empire. That moment, however, was far away. The story begins years earlier, not with wealth or privilege, but with loss. Daniel never knew the comfort of parents waiting at home. His earliest memories were of grey walls and iron beds, lined side by side in an orphanage that smelled of disinfectant and dust. Other children cried for mothers who never came back. Daniel learned quickly that tears did not change reality. He grew quiet, observant, and stubborn. By the time he was old enough to understand what orphan meant, he had already absorbed the whispers. These kids never make it anywhere. They came from volunteers, from foster families who visited once and never returned, from older boys who had given up. But Daniel, even as a child, carried something others could not see. He carried a spark, a restless, unyielding flame. Still, the spark did not protect him from pain. At 12 years old, Daniel was sent to live temporarily with a family who took him in only for the government stipend. They gave him food, yes, but never affection. He was the outsider at the table, the shadow in the house. On more than one occasion, he heard the father mutter, "He'll be gone soon anyway. Don't waste your kindness." When Daniel turned 14, he left that home and returned to the shelter. It was then that he began working odd jobs after school. The law said he was too young, but survival had its own rules. He swept floors at a grocery store, washed cars on weekends, and carried boxes in the back of warehouses where men twice his size barked orders at him. It was during one of those jobs that the world decided to humiliate him in ways he would never forget. At 17, Daniel was cleaning the front of a restaurant, his uniform stained, his body tired from working 3 shifts that week. A group of students from the prestigious high school across town walked by. They laughed loudly, their clothes expensive, their shoes spotless. Among them was a boy who recognized Daniel. They had been in the same class once, before Daniel dropped out temporarily to work. "Look at him," the boy sneered, pointing. "The orphan. Still scrubbing floors. Guess some people really are born to serve." The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, and unforgettable. Daniel froze, the mop heavy in his hands. Every part of him wanted to yell back, to throw the bucket of dirty water at their polished shoes. But he didn't. He lowered his head, swallowed the sting, and whispered a prayer only he could hear. "God, give me strength. One day, I will not be here. One day I will rise." That prayer became a vow. He went home that night, or rather to the small cot in the corner of the shelter, and lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The words of his classmates echoed in his ears. "Born to serve." But in his heart, he answered them, "Born to lead, born to build, born for more." Daniel's childhood may have been filled with emptiness, but his adolescence was where the battle truly began. Every insult, every rejection, every empty plate at dinner shaped his resolve. And though his body was frail, his faith grew stronger. He began to understand that God was his anchor, the only constant in a world that wanted to see him fail. The days of Daniel's youth were measured not by school vacations or family dinners, but by the hours of labor that kept him alive. At 15, while other teenagers worried about weekend parties, Daniel worried about how many cars he could wash before dark, or whether the store owner would pay him fairly for sweeping floors. His adolescence was not gentle, it was sharp, merciless, and full of moments designed to break him. One cold evening, Daniel sat on the steps of a warehouse, wiping sweat from his forehead. He had spent the whole day unloading crates twice his weight, his hands blistered and raw. Inside the warehouse, the manager handed envelopes of cash to the regular workers. When Daniel stepped forward, the man shoved a few crumpled bills into his hand. "That's enough for you," the manager said flatly. "Don't expect more. You're just a kid without a future." The words hit him harder than the work itself. Daniel looked down at the money. It wasn't even enough to buy proper shoes. But instead of answering, he turned his eyes upward to the darkening sky. "God," he whispered, "don't let my heart turn bitter. Give me strength to endure." And endure he did. By 16, Daniel was balancing multiple small jobs while trying to keep up with school. He often arrived late to class, his clothes smelling of soap from the car wash or of sweat from carrying boxes. His classmates whispered behind him, some mocking, some pitying. Teachers noticed him too. One of them, a stern math professor, called him out one morning. "Daniel, if you can't focus on school, why don't you drop out for good?" the teacher said in front of the class. "Education isn't for everyone." The room went silent. Daniel felt the weight of dozens of eyes staring at him. For a second, shame threatened to crush him. But then he straightened his shoulders and replied softly, "With respect, sir, I won't quit. I'll finish, no matter how long it takes." That moment became another vow carved into his soul. Nights were the hardest. While other teenagers slept or played video games, Daniel stayed awake in the shelter, books spread out on his cot, studying under the weak light of a borrowed lamp. His body begged for rest, but his spirit was relentless. He knew that if he surrendered to exhaustion, the world would confirm its prophecy. He'll never be anyone. During those nights, his prayers became his fuel. He would pause between equations or essays, close his eyes and whisper, "Lord, you see me. You know my pain. Give me wisdom. Give me perseverance. Let me rise above this." And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, he felt it, a peace that could not be explained, a strength that did not come from himself. It was as though God placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder and whispered back, "Keep going. Your story isn't over." But faith did not erase humiliation. At 17, Daniel managed to get a part-time job at a cafe in the wealthier part of town. The cafe was bright, modern, filled with students from wealthy families. They ordered lattes and pastries without glancing at the price. Daniel served them with steady hands, but inside he wrestled with envy. One afternoon, a group of university students walked in. Among them was a boy Daniel recognized, the same one who had mocked him at the restaurant years earlier. The boy laughed when he saw Daniel in an apron. "Still serving people, huh?" he said loudly. "Enough for the whole cafe to hear. Guess some things never change." Laughter rippled through the group. Daniel's cheeks burned, but he did not answer. Instead, he walked back to the counter, clenched his fists, and silently repeated his promise. "One day, I won't be here. One day, I'll create something greater than all of this." What his tormentors did not know was that each insult became fuel, each humiliation, each rejection, each moment of being treated as less than human became a brick in the foundation of his determination. And God's hand never left him. When he had no food, someone unexpectedly offered a meal. When his shoes were worn through, a stranger donated a pair. When he thought he might fail his exams, a kind teacher offered him extra help. They were small miracles, but to Daniel, they were proof he was not alone. By the end of his teenage years, Daniel had developed not only resilience, but also vision. He understood something most of his classmates did not. Life was not about comfort, but about endurance. Success was not given, it was built, often in silence, brick by brick, prayer by prayer. At 18, on the night of his final high school exam, Daniel walked out of the testing center, exhausted but proud. The streets were empty, the city asleep. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, Lord. This is only the beginning." He didn't know how, but deep inside he believed his story would not end in poverty or humiliation. He believed God had a greater plan. Adulthood did not arrive for Daniel with celebrations or freedom. It came with more responsibility, heavier burdens, and choices that would test the very core of who he was. At 19, while others his age celebrated their new independence, Daniel was already carrying the weight of survival on his shoulders. After finishing high school, he looked for steady work. His grades had been good enough to dream of college, but tuition was a mountain too high to climb. Instead, he applied for jobs in factories, construction sites, and repair shops. Most employers saw his lack of family, connections, and polished clothes and dismissed him without a second thought. Finally, one small electrical repair shop hired him as an apprentice. The pay was low, but for Daniel it was an opportunity, a door, however small, that God had opened. He worked long hours, learning how wires carried currents, how circuits breathed life into buildings, how hands could transform broken systems into light and power. But even here, humiliation followed him. One afternoon, the shop owner introduced Daniel to a wealthy client. "This is my apprentice," the man said. The client looked Daniel up and down, his second-hand shirt, his worn-out shoes, the grease on his hands, and smirked. "Apprentice?" the client said mockingly. "He looks more like someone you picked off the street," the men laughed. Daniel forced a polite smile, but inside, he clenched his teeth. That night, alone in his small rented room, he prayed with tears streaming down his face. "Lord, they see trash, but you see treasure. Help me prove that their words are lies." That prayer became fuel. Over the next months, Daniel studied relentlessly. He borrowed old manuals, took notes from senior electricians, and practiced until his hands knew the systems by heart. Whenever the shop was empty, he stayed late, rewiring broken boards, fixing what others had thrown away. Slowly, he gained confidence. His mentor began to notice. "Daniel," the man said one day, "you learn faster than most. Keep this up, and you won't just be an apprentice, you'll lead your own projects." For the first time, someone in authority had spoken words of belief instead of doubt. Daniel held onto them like gold. Still, the world had not finished testing him. At 21, he took a part-time job at a large construction site to earn extra money. The workers there were older, rough, and merciless with anyone they deemed weak. On his first week, while carrying heavy equipment, Daniel slipped in the mud. The men burst into laughter. "Careful, orphan boy," one of them jeered. "Don't break the tools. You can't afford to replace them." Their voices cut deep, but Daniel did not answer. Instead, he stood back up, wiped the mud from his clothes, and carried the equipment again, this time with steady steps. Later that night, exhausted and sore, he whispered, "Lord, I will not let shame decide my destiny. If you are with me, I can endure." And endure he did. The years that followed were marked by sweat, sacrifice, and silent victories. Daniel saved every coin he could, eating little, denying himself comforts. At 22, with the small savings he had scraped together, he bought second-hand tools and began offering repair services on weekends. It was humble work, fixing sockets, repairing wires, installing lights, but it was his. People noticed something different about him. He was not just skilled, he was honest. He treated every client with respect, no matter how small the job. Word began to spread. Daniel could be trusted. But even as his reputation grew, so did the tests of his character. One evening, after finishing a repair in a wealthy home, the homeowner paid him less than what they had agreed. When Daniel politely reminded him of the price, the man sneered. "Be grateful you're getting anything at all," he said. "People like you should know their place." Daniel felt anger rising in his chest, but instead of answering harshly, he took a deep breath. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly, and walked away. That night, in prayer, he released his frustration. "Lord, I trust you will provide. I won't let dishonor make me bitter." It was not weakness. It was strength. Strength to hold on when others would quit. By 23, Daniel's weekend work had become steady enough that he dared to dream bigger. He imagined a company, not just a service, but a business that could provide jobs for others like him, people the world had dismissed. But doubt haunted him. How could an orphan with no degree, no investors, no connections, build something so ambitious? The answer came in the quiet of his prayers. With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. He wrote those words on a scrap of paper and taped it above his bed. Every morning, he read them before leaving for work. Every night, he read them before closing his eyes. At 24, Daniel officially registered his first small business. It was nothing more than a one-room office with a borrowed desk and a cheap phone, but to him, it was a palace. The sign on the door read simply, "Daniel Electrical Services." When he unlocked that door for the first time, he whispered a prayer of gratitude. "Lord, this is your doing, not mine. Bless this beginning." He didn't know yet how many storms lay ahead. He didn't know that his faith would be tested even harder, or that success would demand even greater sacrifice. But in that moment, standing in his tiny office, Daniel felt a shift. The orphan was gone. The apprentice was gone. What remained was a man ready to rise, step by step, prayer by prayer. Daniel's 20s became a battlefield between doubt and destiny. With his small business registered, he was no longer just an apprentice or a laborer. He was now responsible for clients and deadlines and, most of all, his own reputation. At first, business was slow. Weeks passed with only a handful of jobs, fixing wiring in small apartments, installing light fixtures in modest shops. Many nights Daniel sat alone in his one-room office, the silence so heavy it felt like failure pressing against his chest. Sometimes he stared at the phone, praying it would ring. "Lord," he whispered, "if this is truly your will, send me work. Show me that my hands can be used for more than survival." And slowly, the work came. A bakery owner recommended him to a neighbor, who recommended him to a cousin. Each satisfied client became a messenger, spreading Daniel's name through the city. His honesty, discipline, and calm spirit stood out in a world where shortcuts and lies were common, but not everyone believed in him. At a local suppliers meeting, Daniel introduced himself to a group of established contractors. They looked at his plain clothes and small business card and chuckled. "Daniel Electrical Services," one of them said with a smirk. "That sounds like a one-man show. Come back when you can handle real projects." The laughter stung, but Daniel stayed calm. He simply replied, "One day, I'll be ready. And when that day comes, I'll remember this conversation." He walked away, dignity intact. That night, as always, he prayed, "Lord, give me patience. Let my work speak louder than their words." By 26, Daniel had hired his first 2 employees, young men from humble backgrounds like his own, eager for a chance. He treated them not as tools, but as partners, teaching them the skills he had fought to learn. At the end of each week, before paying their wages, he prayed over the envelopes. "Bless these hands, Lord, and the families they support." The business began to grow. Small repair jobs turned into contracts for office renovations, then larger residential projects. For the first time in his life, Daniel could afford more than survival. He bought better tools, a used van with his company logo painted on the side, and a small apartment of his own. Yet success brought new tests. At 27, he submitted a bid for a mid-sized commercial project. When the results were posted, Daniel learned that his company had been undercut, not by skill but by corruption. A competitor had bribed the project manager. When Daniel confronted him, the man sneered. "Did you really think an orphan with no connections could play in the big leagues, go back to fixing light bulbs?" Daniel's chest burned with anger, but instead of lashing out, he turned away and prayed, "Lord, fight for me. I will not let injustice poison my soul." 2 months later, the project collapsed due to faulty work by that same competitor. The client, desperate, turned to Daniel. He and his team repaired the mistakes and saved the project. From that day on, Daniel's name became associated with integrity. Still, the road was not easy. Long hours, sleepless nights, and the constant pressure of bills pressed on him. More than once, he thought about giving up. But every time despair whispered in his ear, he remembered the boy who had been mocked for scrubbing floors, and the prayer he had whispered in that moment, "One day I will rise." At 28, Daniel faced one of his most painful humiliations. He attended a business gala, hoping to network with investors. Dressed in his best suit, modest but neat, he approached a table of executives. One of them glanced at his name tag and laughed. "Daniel Electrical, never heard of it? Must be small time." The group laughed with him, then turned their backs, dismissing him as though he didn't exist. Daniel left the event early, his heart heavy. Back in his apartment, he fell to his knees. Tears ran down his face as he prayed, "Lord, why do they still treat me like nothing? Haven't I proven myself? Haven't I worked hard enough?" And in the silence, he felt the answer, not in words, but in peace. A reminder that success measured by men was fleeting, but success measured by God was eternal. Strengthened, Daniel pressed on. By 30, his company had grown into a respected contractor, employing dozens of workers and managing multiple projects at once. What had begun with a single pair of second-hand tools was now a thriving business. His office, once a single room, had expanded into a professional space filled with busy phones and blueprints. Yet Daniel never forgot his foundation. Each morning before work, he gathered his employees for a short prayer. Lord, protect us today, bless our hands, help us respect one another. It became a tradition, one that gave his company not just a reputation for quality, but also for trust and unity. The boy who once prayed under the dim light of a shelter lamp was now a man leading others with the same faith that had carried him through the darkest nights. And still, the world had no idea what greater heights awaited him. By the time Daniel turned 30, the city no longer whispered his name. They spoke it with respect. His company, once a one-man dream, was now recognized as one of the most reliable contractors in the region. His workers wore uniforms with the company's logo. His vans moved through the streets like symbols of progress, and his phone rang constantly with new opportunities. But success is never without storms. One morning, Daniel was invited to bid on a large public project, an office complex in the heart of the city. It was the kind of contract that could elevate his company to a new level, one that would require not just skill, but leadership on a scale he had never attempted. When the news spread, some applauded him, but others scoffed. "He's just lucky," a rival contractor sneered. "He was an orphan, a nobody. He doesn't belong at this table with us." The words traveled fast, whispered in business circles, repeated in meetings where Daniel wasn't present. Some clients pulled back, doubting if his company could handle such responsibility. Daniel felt the weight of those doubts. One night, sitting alone in his office, he bowed his head over the blueprints and prayed, "Lord, you opened the doors to bring me here. If this is your plan, give me courage. If not, close the door and guide me elsewhere." Peace filled the room like a soft light, and Daniel knew he would continue forward, not by his own strength, but by faith. The months that followed were grueling. The project demanded everything: money, manpower, time. There were delays, accidents narrowly avoided, and countless nights without sleep. Rivals watched eagerly, waiting for him to fail. One day, a reporter even asked him during an interview, "Some say you're in over your head. Do you really think someone with your background can deliver a project of this magnitude?" Daniel looked into the camera, steady and calm. "My background doesn't define my limits. My faith does, and with God's help, we will deliver." And deliver he did. The office complex was completed ahead of schedule and under budget, a rare feat in the industry. The city's mayor attended the opening ceremony, praising Daniel's company for its excellence and integrity. For the first time, Daniel stood in front of cameras not as the boy mocked for scrubbing floors, but as a man admired for building foundations that others depended on. Yet with recognition came envy. At 32, a former employee spread false rumors, accusing Daniel of corruption. The media latched onto the story, and for weeks, his reputation hung in the balance. Contracts stalled, clients hesitated. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the ground shake beneath him. He called his closest workers into the office and addressed them with honesty. "Brothers, I won't lie to you. This storm is hard, but we built this company on truth. And truth always stands. Let's keep working, let's keep praying, and let God do the rest." And once again, faith prevailed. Evidence cleared his name, and the false accuser was exposed. The very trial that threatened to destroy him only made his company stronger. But the most powerful victory of those years wasn't financial. At 34, Daniel was invited to speak at a youth conference for underprivileged teenagers. Standing on stage, looking at hundreds of faces that mirrored his own struggles, he told his story. He spoke of the orphanage, of the mockery, of the prayers whispered in the dark. "I stand here today," he said, "not because I was stronger than anyone else, but because I held onto the hand of God when everything else slipped away. If He could lift me, He can lift you." Tears flowed in the audience. For many, Daniel's success was proof that their own scars did not have to define their future. By the time he turned 35, Daniel had not only built a respected company, he had built hope. His projects reached beyond his city into neighboring regions. His story reached hearts, and his faith reached deeper roots than ever before. He was no longer just the orphan boy who survived humiliation. He was a leader, a builder, a man who proved that faith could turn rejection into redemption. And though many thought this was the peak of his story, Daniel knew deep inside, God was only beginning. By the time Daniel reached his 40s, the word orphan no longer carried the weight of shame. It carried the weight of triumph. His company had expanded into a thriving enterprise, building residential towers, hospitals, and schools across the region. His name, once mocked, was now synonymous with integrity, quality, and faith. Yes, he was a millionaire. The boy who once scraped coins together for food now signed contracts worth millions. He drove cars he once only admired from afar, lived in a home more beautiful than anything he could have imagined as a child. To the world, he had everything. But when Daniel spoke of his journey, he never pointed to his cars or his house. He pointed to something deeper. One evening, standing in the boardroom of his company, overlooking the city skyline lit by the very buildings his team had constructed, he whispered the same prayer he had prayed as a boy. "Thank you, Lord. None of this is mine. It's yours. You carried me here." He often reflected on the people who had mocked him, the classmates who laughed at his mop, the teacher who told him education wasn't for him, the clients who paid him less because they thought he had no worth. He felt no bitterness, only gratitude. For without their words, he might never have made the silent vow that fueled his rise. "Pain," he would say in interviews, "is often God's greatest tool. The words meant to break me became the fire that forged me." Every humiliation was a lesson, every rejection a redirection. But Daniel's wealth was not just financial. He used his resources to fund scholarships for orphans, to support shelters like the one he once lived in, to give others the opportunities he had to fight so hard for. At ribbon-cutting ceremonies, when young children smiled in schools his company had built, Daniel felt a joy no bank account could measure. One day, a journalist asked him, "What does it feel like to be a millionaire after everything you went through?" Daniel smiled gently. "The millions are numbers in a bank account. My true wealth is knowing I can look someone in the eyes with respect, that I can give back what I once needed, and that I walked this journey with God by my side. Money fades. Faith and dignity last forever." And that was the legacy he left, not one of riches alone, but of resilience, humility, and unwavering belief. The orphan who was told he would never be anything became a man who proved that with faith, perseverance, and the courage to endure humiliation without surrendering to bitterness, anything is possible. Daniel's story was no longer just his own. It became a reminder to all who heard it, that no matter where you begin, no matter what others call you, no matter how dark the nights or how heavy the burdens, if you hold on to faith, if you keep moving forward, your story can change. And as Daniel often said, don't measure yourself by where you start. Measure yourself by how far God can take you.